We'll do a review in Lakutis Sichas and Chelek Zayin, volume 16. We'll do now the second Sicha from the Parshas Vayakhel. This is also, as it says in the star here, this is also a siyum of Masechta Chagiga, and it's actually earlier in volume 16 on page 309. As he brings the note over here, we already learned part of that same siyum that the Rebbe made, and this is just a second part of that siyum. But this is going to be a siyum, but the Rebbe begins by pointing out that in the Hashras Hashchina in the Mishkan, there were two levels. There was the Mishkan itself, and then there was the Hashras Hashchina that came through the Oren. And the Rebbe will bring in also from the Gemara over there the two levels of the Gemara says that the Ein Oir Shel Gehenim Shoylet in the Tzadikim and then in Pesha Yisrael. And the Rebbe is going to talk about the whole chilek between the impact of Torah, the impact of mitzvahs, and how these two aspects are the part of the Mishkan's presence of Hashem and the Shechinah and the Mishkan, and also it becomes more unified or united with the person through the level of Torah, as the Rebbe will say. But let's go step by step. So we'll start with Ois Aleph. So the first ois, the Rebbe just wants to point from the Medrash that there is actually two separate expression of the Shechina that comes from the general Mishkan, and then as it comes from the Oren specifically. Aleph. If the Pasuk, so he brings two Medrashim. First he brings on the Pasuk Vayaz Betzalel es Oren. So here we're giving Betzalel the credit for making the Oren. Somehow the Medrash wants to explain why Betzalel made the Oren. So this Medrash says because Betzalel came up with the idea that the Mishkan should be built after the Oren. So because the honor of the Torah that goes in the Oren, that should come before building the general Mishkan, and that's why he is the one that is called on his name, Vayaz Betzalel es Oren, which, by the way, as the Rebbe points out in the Oren, this goes against what the Gemara says and in other places that the Mishkan was built before the Oren. But let's first learn the Medrash inside. State in Medrash, B'sho Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu LeMoshe. Asay HaMishkan, go ahead. Hashem says to Moshe, make the Mishkan. So he came and said to Betzalel that Hashem says to make a Mishkan. So Betzalel says to Moshe, Ma'u Mishkan Hazeh. What is the Mishkan? This Mishkan that we're talking about. So Moshe told Betzalel, Hashem will rest. The divine will be in the Mishkan. That's the person of the Mishkan. And another point is that he'll teach the Yidden Torah. So Betzalel says further to Moshe, where is the Torah going to be placed? So Moshe Rabbeinu said, once we'll make the Mishkan, we'll also make the ark, we'll make the box, and for the luchas. So Betzalel said, Rabbeinu Moshe, Master Moshe, this is not honorable for the Torah. First we'll make the Oren, and then we'll make the Mishkan. So he said we have to give the honor of the Torah to make first the Oren and the Mishkan. The Fikoch says the Medrash, Zocho, Betzalel merited Shikore al Shemoy, that the construction of the Oren is called on the name of Betzalel, Shenemar, Vayaz Betzalel Soren. So we see from this Medrash that there's a Shekhinah that comes from in the Mishkan, and then there's something unique that comes from the Torah, different. So the Medrash is mashma, as the Torah in Inyan HaOren, that the idea, the meaning, the concept of the Oren is Abazundar Zach, is something separate from Hashros HaShechinah b'Mishkan than the resting of the Shechinah in the Mishkan. When Azoi is mashma lechoyre from an under medrash, and there's also another medrash where it appears the similar thing. As noch dem boy in the Mishkan, as after they build the Mishkan, or the Eibishter gezogt, Hashem says, "Tikamtem achsanyo la'atzmi." You have prepared a place for me to be at, an achsanya, a place to stay for me. Now go and fix a place for the Torah to stay, which is the Torah is going to be my meat. So again, we're dividing here between the Mishkan and the Oren, and the Luchas and the Torah. It's not verstandig, so it's not understood. Hein emes, let it be true as der mokim hat Torah. Is there Oren? We know the place. Where is the Torah? The Torah is in the ark. Aber iker menuchas v'hashros hashchina. But when we talk about what was the main resting and the divine place, is the Choch given in und durch the Oren. That was in and through the Oren. The Oren was a major part of the menucha, the hashros hashchina, where the Shechina do rest. And with the Rambam is mevayer, as the Rambam explains, as iker hachefetz b'mishkan, the main objective, the main item, the main object was the Mishkan, is Mokem Menuchas HaShechina She'oren, is the place where the Shechina rested, which is the Oren. That means that the Oren is the main place of the Shechina. So how are we dividing it over here? As Klolos HaMishkan V'Amygdosh is to Libashoras HaShechina. The Mishkan, the Migdosh is HaShoras HaShechina, and the Oren is the Mokem HaTorah. And the Orim is the place of the Torah. As the Rebbe will explain towards the end of the Sikha, that there's two separate ways of the Shechina manifest itself, which is the general and through the Orim. This base, the Rebbe will continue to explain that he will explain this by explaining the Mishkan in a personal level, because we say b'soich kol echad ve'echad, and the difference between the way Torah impacts a person and then the way mitzvahs impact a person, and that will give an understanding also of the hashros hashchina in general. And the Rebbe will bring down the end of the Gemara in Chagiga, as we will see inside. Oisbeis. But das Verstehen behagdim will understand this by introducing the hashros, explaining by introducing how it works in the human by the person, and then we'll understand it in the Mishkan. The hashros hashchina b'Mishkan, the ikri migdosh, the resting of the Shechina in the Mishkan, which is also called the Migdosh. So it's both is ongizog geworden, was instructed make for me a Migdosh, and then I'll dwell amongst them. From the change of language, the Torah changes, instead of saying I'll rest within it in the Mishkan, but it says b'seicham amongst them. So we learn this is connected with something else, not only with the Mishkan. That we dwell amongst each and every one of them. There is the Shechina with each one of them. So that we'll explain, as the Rebbe will go on later. But first, the biur for hashros hashchina in the betoich, in the Migdash HaPrati, that's, we have to introduce that. That's where we're going to start by explaining how the divine presence is in the Migdash HaPrati, in the individual, personal Migdash of every Jew. So the Rebbe brings down now like this: from B'siu Masechta Chagiga Zog the Gemara. In the end of the Gemara and the Tractate Chagiga, the Gemara says, Amar Babo. Rabbi said the name of Rabbi Lozor, Omar Rabbi Lozor, Talmidei Chachomim ein oir shel Gehenim sheletes behem. that the fire of Gehenna does not dominate them, cannot take them over the Talmid Chachamim. Even if we will say that a Talmid Chacham that has to spend some time, as Rabbi will explain later on, in Gehenna, but the fire of the Gehenna cannot dominate them. Shalet is behem. How do we know that? Because we know that as a Kal V'chomer, Misalamandra, a Kal V'chomer from the Salamandra. Uma Salamandra, Shatol de Soeshi, a Salamandra which is a derivative of fire. It's not fire itself, it comes from fire. And we know that Hasoch Midoma, one who would anoint, put of the blood of this Salamandra, fire cannot dominate the person that smeared the blood of the Salamandra. So therefore, Talmid Chacham, Shakol Gufar Eish, Talmid Chacham, whose whole body is fire, they're not just a tool to say, they're fire himself. Diksiv, because the verse says, Haloi koi dvorai ko'esh, my words are like fire, Neum Hashem says Hashem. So that means that the Talmid Chacham who learns dvorai, he is like fire. Alachas kama v'kama. How much more so the fire of Gehenna cannot dominate them. Further, the Gemara says, Omer Shlokish says, Shlokish, an oir shall Gehenna sheletes b'poshi Yisrael, that the fire of the Gehenna cannot dominate. And here we're saying even the sinners of Israel cannot dominate them. How do we learn that out? And Kal V'chomer min Mizbach Hazov. We learn this as a foretory from the golden Mizbeach. Ma Mizbeach Hazov. Because we see the golden Mizbeach she'ein olav elo ka'evi dinar. How thick was the layer of the gold on top of the Mizbeach HaPnim, the Mizbeach Hazov? How much was it? It was size of a dinner. That was the thickness of a dinner, a small thickness of Zov. Kama shonim in all these years, ein ha'ir sheletas boy. They were burning the Ketores constantly, but the Ketores did not burn the Mizbeach. Why? Because that covered the layer of gold that was only dinner, did not allow for the fire to burn it. So Poisha Yisrael Shemalei Mitzvahs Kerimim. So the sinners of Israel, even though that they're sinners of Israel, but still they are full with mitzvahs, just as a pomegranate is full with seeds. How do we know that? Because we learn it out from the posuk. It says Kapela Chorim and Rakosach, that you are like the Rimmon. The posuk is describing there's Al Tikri Rakosach Elo Rekonim Shabach. But this means the Rakosach means those empty ones. That's the Poisha Yisrael. So they have basically a lot of cover because of the all the mitzvahs that they have. So they have a lot of cover. So notwithstanding that there is mistakes and they're Poisha Yisrael, still it alachas kavakama, how much more so they will not be able to be dominated by the fire of the Gehenna. So these are the statements that the ends the Gemara in Chagiga. But what is the connection to the Gemara in Chagiga? Because in the Mishnah, the last Mishnah over there, it talks about the Mizbeach HaZohav, and we learned this all in the Sikha before, Mizbeach HaZohav and the Mizbeach, about the tzipui, whether it's Bekabel Tuma, not Bekabel Tuma. So as a follow-up, so really the main point over here is to talk about the Mizbeach HaZohav, which we talked about the cover on the Mizbeach HaZohav, whether it's Bekabel Tuma because of that or not, as brought down in that previous Sikha. But and then Chagav, he brings down also the story of Oir Talmidei Chachamim. But still, it doesn't fit, as the Rebbe is going to ask. The Pashtus Leretman, simply we learn, as the Shaykhs from the Tzvei Meimeris is, what's the connection between these two statements? Is Behemshech to the Sugya Friya, the previous discussion Was red wegen dem Zipfel von dem Mizbechis. It talks about the cover, the overlay of the Mizbechis. We talked about the Mizbech and the Chazov and the Choshes. The inner Mizbech was from gold. The outside the Mizbech Chitz was copper. So Vertarom gebracht the Memre for Rish Lakish. So really, we're trying to bring down the statement of Rish Lakish as Ein Shoyer Shel Gehenim Shel Let the Pasha Yisrael Kavacherem Mizbech Hazov, that there's no fire of the Gehenim cannot dominate the sinners of Israel as they Kavacherem from the Mizbech Hazov. Was the Adgoshis in them, was their Mizbech is given with Supezov. So the emphasis here is that it was covered with gold. So, covered with gold, this fits with the idea that it doesn't dominate the Peish Yisrael. So it's the same subject where we say that fire doesn't dominate the Peish Yisrael, but gebracht für die Mem von Rabbi Lezer, was red, Rabbi Lozer, was red wegen dem, as einer shall Gehenim shall let Tamid Chacham, that the Erev Gehenim does not shall Tamid Chacham. That's the connection here. So, if the main thing is to bring down the Mizbeach Hazov, that Gosha, the din of Rish Lakish, of the Peish Yisrael, that should come first. If he's over it verstandig. For Rish Lakish. So in that case, first we should have the statement of Rish Lakish. Mizbeach Hazov. The memory for Rabbi Elazar, and then the statement of Rabbi Elazar as far as it relates to Talmid Chacham. The Rabbi Elazar statement has no shaykhs to us. Rabbi Elazar has a shaykhs statement about the Talmid Chachamim because of Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish is shaykhs to us. So first we should have Rish Lakish, and then we should talk about the case of Rabbi Elazar. The other thing is, Rebbe says in the Gemara in Eruvin, where there's the main part about Gehenim dominating, and over there we don't bring Bechlal. Over there we bring the case of Rish Lakish, and we don't bring the case of Rabbi Elazar. Base Ikir Hasuga wegen Peish Yisrael in Shaychas zu Shlitus Gehenim. The main discussion where there is the main sugya about the fact that the sinners of Israel, how in connection to the dominance of Gehenim, in general it talks about Gehenim over there, is a Masechta Eruvin. That's a Tracta Eruvin. Was dort wird euch gebracht die Memre von Rish Lakish. Over there it's also brought the statement of Rish Lakish, as Peish Yisrael ein Ershel Gehenim Shalet B'Am Chulu, that the sinners of Israel, the fire of Gehenim does not dominate them. Since that's the case, hat doch die Gemara gedacht dort bringen euch die Memre von Rabbi Elazar. So the Gemara should have read also the case, the statement of Rabbi Elazar, Tamid Chachamim ein Ershel Gehenim Shalet B'Am Chulu, that it doesn't dominate the Tamid Chachamim, just like over here. Should bring it. But Aleph dort is the Ikar Hasugi bin Yizeh. She belongs there because that's the main discussion is over there. Like in Chagigis is never that a Chagav. Here we're just bringing it down, by the way, because we talked in the Mishnah about Mitzupezov, about the overlay and the relationships. That's why we bring it down. And base Masechta Erev in this far Masechta Chagigah, that comes before Masechta Chagigah. Number three, Bechlal, also on the statement of Rish Lakish. Over here, it seems like Rish Lakish seems to tell us just the opposite than what the point was in the Mishnah. The point in the Mishnah was that the sipui, the overlay, the cover, the gold, or the copper, are not an entity by themselves, but they become subjugated to the Oren. Here the emphasis is that they're so strong, they don't allow the fire. So we're bringing seemingly an opposite idea. Gimel. He makes it a foretory from Mizbach Hazov. It only has the thickness of a golden dinner. The light, the fire does not dominate it. Is the seems to be just the opposite emphasis from what the Gemara concluded earlier as loy dirabonon. According to the Rabbanon, there was the Machlokes there, but according to the Rabbanon, is miftal bottle tzipui gabayu, that the overlay of the mizbeach is bottled to the mizbeach. That tzipu from mizbeach and a choshev v'hazov, the covering, the overlay of the mizbeach and a choshev and the zov is bottled, is subject to the mizbeachs. And the far is the mizbeach nit mekabel tumah. It's not mekabel tumah, even though it has gold metal, which should be mekabel tumah. It's a klios lemachas or it's aid kemaimer. But so over there, the point here is that it does not significant enough as just being an overlay to take away from the status of the mizbeach, and that's why it's not mekabel tumah. But the maimer is shlokish. The statement is shlokish is mudgish the starkheit. Over here, we emphasize the strength. Heder habitl, which is the lack of the nullification for the tzipus of shalom mizbeach from the golden cover of the mizbeach. As the tzipu hat sich gehalten, that the cover lasted, verhit and protected durch sein starker the kli, through its strength, it protected the keli, it didn't burn. The mizbeach, bis as einer shletes by that the fire could not dominate. So it seems like we're bringing it down in connection. But the point is just the opposite. The point of the Mishnah, according to the Rabbanon, is the point that they are subjugated and they're not mekabel tumah because they're not an entity by itself. And here we're telling you how strong they are, so that they don't allow for the mizbeach to burn, and they protect the mizbeach in that way. So that's emphasizing their strength. This Gimel, the Rebbe will continue to ask several more questions. First of all, the Rebbe wants to know, why do we need two Kal V'chaimers? If we say that Poishi Yisrael are not going to be dominated by the fire of Gehenna, of course, the Talmid Chachamim. And even if we need a separate statement, why would we have to learn it out from a Sheretz versus learning it out from the Mizbeach Hazov, like we learn it out for the Poishi Yisrael? Let's look inside. Gimel. We also have to understand several points, questions in the memories from the Gemara, in this statement of the Gemara. Some of them as follows. Aleph, number one. The Kal V'Chomer from Mizbeach Hazov, the Kal V'Chomer that we learn from the gold Mizbeach, was the Gemara Zog B'Negei Tzipeishi Yisrael, which the Gemara says with regards to the sinners of Israel, is the guilty b'mekolshke v'kal v'chemer. So that would apply, it would seem for sure, and a kal v'chemer b'negetz tamid chacham, for a tamid chacham. If we say it that it protects the sinner of Israel, so of course tamid chacham. As kishem v'der zohav los nitzu, just as the gold does not allow kein fire to mizbech, doesn't allow fire to the mizbeach, to burn down the mizbeach, is euch the Torah von Talmud Chacham lost nicht zu. So the Torah Talmud Chacham does not allow to say the Mershel Gehenna, the fire of Gehenna. Even if they've done matters which are not appropriate, for which they deserve Gehenna, so Lula is Chus HaTorah, so they would have been burnt. But now that they have the Torah doesn't allow for the Gehenna to burn them. That's a beautiful Kal V'Chomer from, we could have said, from the Mizbeach Hazov, is doch nicht verstandig, Aleph, so we understand. The ganze Meimer wegen Talmud Chacham is the whole statement about Talmud Chacham is extra. Or because we can learn it out as a foratory course from the Minyan of Meimer, from the idea and the statement, but against Poishi Yisrael, as far as the statement as it relates to the Poishi Yisrael, that they're not going to be burnt by the fire of Gehenna. So certainly the Talmid Chacham are not going to be burned by the fire of Gehenna. Base, but the Gemara brings the Meimer of Talmid Chacham, and the Gemara does bring the special statement for Talmid Chacham. Why do we need a different Kal V'Chomer from the salamander? we can use the same cover in the Mizbech, as the Rebbe mentioned before, that the Talmid Chacham, even though maybe he did something wrong, deserves to be burned, but yet the cover that he gets from the Torah protects him so that the fire doesn't burn him. And now the Rebbe says, but the problem, we're bringing up a kavachimer from an insect which is not kosher. The kashvet noch starker. Salamander is asheret stomach. That's a impure insect. Or a kavar machaya. Minimally, it's a chaya. Even if we're not going to say that it's a tummy insect, but tofarvozomen uplenen an inyan benegeya to Talmid Chacham from Asheretz. Why do we have to learn an idea? We're talking about a Talmid Chacham, and we're going to learn it from Asheretz. B'shas mekendos uplen from Mizbech Hazov. We can learn the same thing from the Golden Mizbech. Was is in Beis Hamikdash? Was in Beis Hamikdash, which is the Beis Hamikdash. So why would we choose to learn something from Asheretz when we can learn it from the Beis Hamikdash? Beis. Wie bald das die Talmid Chacham im Pesach Yisrael gefunden sich beide in Gehenim Fazer Avedos? Why are the Talmid Chacham and the Pesach Yisrael in the first place in Gehenim? It's because of their sins. What we're saying, nor their oir shall Gehenim is zenit sholet. It doesn't dominate them. By the ersten Fall was es eine Talmid Chacham. The first case we bring down from Rabbi Wolosow is because they're Talmid Chacham. It doesn't dominate them. And by the zweiten, and by the second case, Reish Lakish brings down was es eine Malay mitzvahs because they have mitzvahs. So the fire doesn't affect them. Is farvos ruft man sei in ersten Fall nor Talmid Chacham und in den zweiten Fall nor Pesach Yisrael. So we're calling them in the first case Talmid Chacham, but they're made mistakes. Why they Gehenna? They're and in the second case, we just refer to them as Pesach Yisrael. So we're just talking about their sins. We're not talking about what they have otherwise besides their sins, it seems like. So what's going on up here? And the Rebbe is going to explain that there's actually an afkemina between how the protection works from the level of Torah, and that Torah actually transforms the person himself into that level of Aish, into the level of Salamandra. And sometimes a Talmid Chacham can be more guilty than an ordinary person, because while he's a Talmid Chacham, he should be more responsible for that. And on the other hand, find both ways. Let's look inside. Dal, der Bir bekolzeh. So what's the explanation of all this? Der Verbund und Chibur von Eden mit Neibrischten. How do the Yidden connect to Hashem? Is durch zwei Inyanim. It's through aspects. Durch Limud HaTorah, through the study of Torah, und durch Kiyum HaMitzvah, the observance of mitzvahs. But there is a difference between the study of Torah and observance of mitzvahs. When a Yid studies Torah, and he understands God's blessed wisdom in his intellect, he understands it. Then he becomes one. He fuses basically with Torah. This is a fusion, such a wondrous fusion that there is no such a fusion, not a yichud. To be one and united, actually from every corner and every side. The person's existence becomes Torah. That's the impact of Torah. That's the connection of Torah. Mitzvahs as opposed to mitzvahs. Although when you're doing a mitzvah, the observer of the mitzvah, the one who fulfills the mitzvah, becomes a chariot, becomes a merkava, a dwelling for the will of Hashem. He becomes a receptacle, it becomes a merkava, a carriage to fill and to follow the will of Hashem. But he does not become one. He is not fused with the mitzvah like with Torah. This is the difference between the two statements between Rabbi Elazar and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Elazar he talks about the advantage of Torah of a Yidden who are Talmidei Chacham. Through Torah, their body becomes fire. Was Eish do mean Dvorei Eish, that says Torah. What does it mean they become fire? The words of Torah are like fire, so he becomes fire. They become totally one, united. They become fused with Torah and godliness. Biz as Torah, to the extent that Torah Verzer Metzias can all becomes their existence, who they are. But the Rish Lakish read wegen der Meile from mitzvahs by Pesha Yisrael. He talks about the advantage of mitzvahs by those who are sinners of Israel, that they are still Malay mitzvahs kirim and they're full with mitzvahs like the pomegranate. Although the mitzvahs do not bring about that fusion, that union from their mitzvah mit nidin, the mitzvah with the yid, it doesn't become one. Von deswegen seien sie alkoponim kelim, but yet they become receptacles, they become vehicles or merkava, they become leim mitzvahs, they become full with mitzvahs. Und der Fahr is ein ershel gehenim shalatas behem, and it doesn't dominate them, the fire of Gehenna, because of their being full with mitzvahs. Not that they're fire themselves, but they're full with it. This is if their deal, Maleim mitzvahs kiriman. Specifically, we're saying like a pomegranate, which means the seeds are the seeds and the pomegranate is the pomegranate. The seeds are not one with the pomegranate, because by mitzvahs, it doesn't become one. That's why there's a diuk, Maleim mitzvahs kiriman. Punkt ve'arimen, just like the pomegranate. Agam is mole from garinim, even though he's full with seeds. Seinen aber die garinim abzunder mit seeds for sich. These seeds are a separate entity on themselves. Similarly, is by the sinners of Yin. Agam zeizane mekayim mitzvahs. Although they are fulfilling mitzvahs, is aber nit gufan mitzvahs. Their body is not mitzvahs, nor melei mitzvahs kirimen. They're full like a pomegranate. The difference between Torah becomes the mitzias, and mitzvahs becomes the keli for the yichud, but not their mitzias. The became, and yet, even though we have a advantage that their body is fire, that the fire of Gehenim does not dominate the Talmud Chochem from Pesha Yisrael. We said before it's a foratory, no. But when a Talmud Chochem fall durch in Advar Avera, when a Talmud Chochem fails and violates a sin, a matter of a sin, is as mer chomor vidosvos that giton from a Pesha Yisrael. That's more serious than that which is done from a sinner of Israel. Al derech, similar to we say, Talmud Chochem Shugog is naslam kizdonis. We say that if a Talmud Chochem violates, even if he did a mistake, it becomes like an intentional, because it's more expected. They should know. So we can't learn a Talmud Chochem from a Pesha Yisrael. But on the other hand, I can it up learn a Pesha Yisrael from Talmud Chochem. Cannot learn a Pesha Yisrael Talmud Chochem, because Talmud Chochem is protected because his body. But Talmud Chochem is gufon eish because his body is fire. A mile was in the top by the Pesha Yisrael, by Pesha Yisrael, that doesn't exist by Pesha Yisrael. So now we'll also understand why we needed to come out to the Talmud Chochem, to the limit from the Sheretz, from the Salamandra, and we didn't learn it from the Mizbeach, as the Rebbe asked before. Hey, so Loidem is yet verstandig. Like according to this, we also understand. For most Talmid Chachamim learned men up from Salamandra. And Talmid Chachamim we are learning from Salamandra. Pesha Yisrael from Mizbeach Hazov, and the sinners of it will learn from the Mizbeach Hazov. Salamandra is told as Eish. It is a derivative of fire. The dogmas Talmid Chacham, similar Talmid Chacham was kol guf and Eish. The entire body is fire. Their Metzias is Torah. The Metzias is Torah. With them Kal v'Chaymer. This Kal v'Chaymer kum to Rabbi Elazar Eich Masber Zayin. What he's coming here also to explain. The Redman wegen Talmid Chacham was guf and Eish. We're talking about a Talmid Chacham whose body is fire. So is vikum dachin by Talmid Chacham. If he has body is fire, the koid v'orei eish. So what is he doing in Gehenna? Why does he have? How does he have a chet? Uleidoch and on the other. If we say that he is a sinner. So what are we saying that he's fired? If it applies to them sins, but the Fargefin is in Gehenna, that's why they find themselves in Gehenna. These Meglach, how is it possible as that the fire of Gehenna does not dominate them? And they remain with that body is fire that stays there to protect them. If them come the Kavachimer from Salamandra, was to this issue. But this is why we have the Kavachimer from the Salamandra, who is a derivative of fire. The Gemara says that Iker Tfilusa Benura, the main way to immerse oneself, to clean oneself from the tumah, is in fire. Fire cleans. As the Iker HaMetayr for tumah is Eish. Mervi Meir, that's the main, even more than water. So it seems Bald as Eish is Metayr from tumah, since fire it cleans from tumah, and Nem Tarab tumah takes and removes tumah, is the Kolshken as von Eish can tumah nit werden. So how could tumah become from Eish then? If Eish is removed, so a salamandra who is totally fire, how could a salamandra have tumah? Zet man aber as von Eish wird a salamandra. That from Eish there's a salamandra, a sheretz tomei, a koponim, a chaye, and a sheretz a chaye. So you see, it's Eish and yet it's tomei. Sheretz tomei, or maybe a chaye. For the zweite Seite, and on the other hand, still is a soch medomo for the salamandra. One who would anoint from the blood of salamandra is in by. The light will not, the fire will not dominate. Is that full move on? Alachas kam v'kam. How much more so? Talmud Chochem was called gufoneish. Their entire body is fire. Aschot can zayin. Although it's possible, the mitzvahs that should be a case. They should fail in sins. Mitzad them was their neshama. Defines itself in a body of flesh and blood. And in this world in which the evil are strengthening, overpowering from deswegen, so they still remain, their body still remains fire. And the fire does not dominate them, just like this salamandra. Still fails sometimes. It can be a share, but still, Soch Medama protects from fire. But this does not apply to Pesh Yisrael. They're only filled with mitzvahs. So there we bring the Kavachimer from Mizbech Hazov versus Mitzupa Zov. There, the Mizbech Hazov is overlaid with gold. It's covered with gold. But durch mitzvahs vertayid blois Mitzupa. Through mitzvahs, a yid is only becomes covered. Wird herumgenommen von der mitzvah, he is encompassed from the mitzvah, und the mitzvah beschützt him, and that mitzvah protects him. Aber wird nicht meyuched mit der mitzvah, but he doesn't become united with the mitzvah as it is by the case of Torah. Move on. Based on this is understood that the reason was the the first category we call them by Talmud Chacham. Und dem zweiten we call Pesh Yisrael. The second category is sinners of Israel. The Baal by Talmud Chacham is Gufon Eish, since the body is fire. Because they made the mistakes and they are in Gehenna, we cannot call them sinners of Israel. For not only can you, because they're really, their body is still fire, but you're not allowed to degrade them. When you shame, you degrade a Talmud Chacham is mevazah Torah, then you're shaming the Torah. But we can't uptell Talmud Chacham from Torah. You can't separate the Talmud Chacham from the Torah. But the Gemara says Talmud Chacham shesorach, a Talmud Chacham who said they mevazah mizrim farhesya. Then publicly you don't shame him. So the Farzog the Gemara Talmud Chacham ain't Urshel Gehenim Shalatas B'hem. He's a Talmud Chacham. They wanted to say a Pesha because of the sins that he's done. And from this we understand, as is by Zay Pasir, Yonim built to the Tzuyim. Why is he in Gehenna? So we understand that things that are not wanted happen with them. As opposed to when we talk about simple people, even though they're full with mitzvahs like a pomegranate, is Meglech, Mizol Zay Mevazah Zayin. it's possible that you are shaming them. In the mitzvahs, you're not touching any of the mitzvahs that they have. They own all the mitzvahs they have. For them, their mitzvahs need the mitzvahs because that's not their existence. Mitzvahs is not their mitzvahs. Mitzvahs nor Malay mitzvahs canal. They're just filled with mitzvahs. But the Gemara is medayik ze'onzum Pesha Yisrael. Why is the Gemara specifically make sure to call them sinners of Israel to shame them because while they're bizoyin, that degradation is that tilfus their kapora. That's part of their atonement. The Gemara says that Cheskia girir atzamasova mitzvah chavolim. The Chacham were masking with that. Three things, you have three things not. And one of the things is his father was a such a sinner, so he dragged his bones with degradation. The Chachamim agreed to that. Why? Because that was part of his kapora. So up till here, we explained as it pertains to the besoich kol echad ve'echad, the two avodas, the avodah of Torah, which makes you like the Eish itself, becomes the person. The avodah of mitzvahs, which is a keli, which is mlei mitzvahs. It's only like the tzipui of the mizbeach. And now we're going to bring this back to the Beis Hamikdash, because the Beis Hamikdash we also have a machloikis. What's the main goal? Is it the main goal, the Shros Hashchina, according to the Ramban, and according to the Rambam, is to bring the korbanos? And the Rebbe said these are actually two aspects. They're not necessarily arguing, but you have both aspects. You have the aspect of the Orin, which is mainly the level of Hashros Hashchina over there, but you also have the korbanos, which is the level of Berurim, which is like the mitzvahs, and we'll see inside Zion. For Maimar Azal, the saying of the statement was also Migdav Shachanti B'Soicham. So make the mixture, the sanctuaries shall dwell amongst you. B'Soichel Nemera B'Soichel B'Soichel Echad V'Echad Miyisrael. It's not only in the Beis Hamikdash Mishkan, but in every year. It's verstandig, so we understand as Punkt wie in the Mishkan Haproti, just as in the personal Mishkan. Seine dort zwei Unionen, there are the two aspects from Torah mitzvahs, as they seinen ze faran in the Mishkan and Mikdash HaKloli, they also exist in the Mishkan and the general Mikdash. The Bir was the explanation is in the Tachlis from the Mishkan and Mikdash. What's the goal of the Mishkan and Mikdash? And dort zwei days, we have two opinions. Das Rambam Kinal mentioned before, as Iker HaChefes b'Mishkan, who main desire in the Mishkan is Mokim Menuchas Hashchina Shuhu Oren. Is the main thing that the vine should rest, which is the Oren. Das Ramban, and the view of the Rambam, Ados is Liyos Makrivim by Karbonis, so that you should bring the Karbonis over there. Yeshleimar, so the Rebbe says, we can say as Be'etzem Ha'inyan, in the idea itself is Marom Archodom Marom Archodom Lepligi. They each one says their own thing, but it's not really a disagreement between. We can fit both in the Ramban and the Rambam. In the V'Shachanti B'Soichem and Mishkan, there are two aspects in this resting that the Eibishter says, I'll rest amongst them. Aleph, number one is in Mishkan Zol Zayin Elakus Begilui, that in the Mishkan there shall be godliness openly, U'Ba'oifim Pnim in inner ways, does haste in an Oifim from Yichud, that should be fused, union, everything that it should take in the Mishkan should be godliness in a pnimis. And number two, that the divine presence should be in the lower one. Through the sorting out from the lower matters, the physical matters. The inyan for mitzvahs, as mitzvahs do. Which are dressed up in physical matters specifically. Und da seine die zwei Unionen von Oren and Karbonis by Mishkan Bechlal. These are the two aspects of the Oren, the Karbonis. And if we talk about the Mishkan versus the Oren, Aleph, in Oren, which is Inyan HaTorah, the Oren, which is the Torah, is given Elokus Begilu. Over there, godliness was open. How do we see? The measure of the Oren did not have a measure. You can see, you can see that notwithstanding the way it fitted into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, we saw that it didn't take up any space even though it's a Masai Vachetzi and Amma Vachetzi, or the dimensions of the Aron, and yet in the space, it didn't take up any space in the Kodesh HaKadosh. But Gizena, the Metziz, and the Mokim Gashmi Shel Aron is Alakus. You were able to see that the entity of this physical space of the Aron is godliness. It's a non-space entity. But nor is Nimna Hanimnois. It's only Hashem. Elokus is someone who is nothing can stop him. He's preventable of anything that would prevent him. There's nothing to prevent him. It's a Messiah. It has to be 2.5 davke, ubedavke, ubediyuk. So it's not creating a non-order. It has to be an order. It has to have a measure. It has to have 2.5, specifically 2.5, and specifically that number. And yet at the same time, it doesn't take up any space. When they measured it from the walls to the walls, you saw that the space of the order didn't make it any place. But this is the advantage of this fusion, this union, is accomplished through the Torah. Base, the other aspect is the Karbonos. That's the service of Karbonos. And also the Mishkan in general. Karbonos brings the animals and elevates it, and the items that are brought as gifts, they took whether 13 or 15, depending how you counted, of the 13 and 15 gifts that the Yidden brought, Gashmi. Amygdala for the neighbors, you made for them a sanctuary for Hashem. So you transferred things from their material, physical being into Kedusha. That's bringing down Shekhinah in the lower levels. Similar to the sorting out of physical matters through observance of mitzvahs. Although also the Mishkan in general, not only in the order, but in the Mishkan in general, by Karbonos Befrat, and specifically by Karbonos, is given Gila Lakus, there was the revelation of godliness, as an given Nisim, the miracles, etc. He says, aber dort nicht given beäufen, it wasn't in a way, as der Guf HaMetzias from the Dvorim Gashim is geworden Lakus. There wasn't in such a way that the essence of the physical, the body of the physical matter became a godliness. The Oren itself became godliness, doesn't have a measure, but there were Nisim, miracle, but not change the essence of the material, the physical. Is move on. So based on this is understood, was the Medrashim Hanam, the Medrashim in the beginning of the Sicha. The Rebbe pointed out that made the two separate. There is a Shechina that comes in the Mishkan, there's a Shechina that comes in the Oren. Seine Mechalik zwischen dem Oren und dem Klolus HaMishkan, they make a distinction between the Oren and the general Mishkan. Chotch is in allgemein, although in general is Menuchas Vashros HaShechina Mishkan, the resting and the dwelling of the divine in the Mishkan given in und durch dem Oren. It was in and through the Oren, and yet we count it into two separate because very specifically there are two matters. Number one, Aleph Achsanya La'atzmi, that is for myself. This is the Hamshochas Hashchina in the Dvorim Gashmim Fun Mishkan. That is bringing down the Shechina in the physical matter of the Mishkan. In Unavedes HaKorbanos, that's the service of Korbanos. Because the Achsanya is al derech din mitzvahs. That that host is like the mitzvahs. Sees their farbund zwischen Elokus mit Welt. It's a tie, a connection between godliness and world. An achsanya v'dira be'elam hazagashmi. It is a host and a place to live in this physical world. That's one level. But be'ez achsanya l'Torah. There's a host for Torah. The hashros hashchina we see in Oren is separate. That's a unique type of resting and fusion and yichud, the hashros hashchina as it's in the Oren. Was in them is the mile of yichud. Over here we have that level, the advantage of yichud. Was Elokus Yisbarach is miyuchad mit Oren. Hashem's godliness is united, fused with the Oren. And then the place of the Oren, there's no space. Was das is Bedumas Amaila von Talmud Chochem. This is the advantage that we talked about for Talmud Chochem, as durch Torah werden Gufan Eishta. Through the Torah, their body becomes a fire. So they are absorbed, that they are become part. They become, that is who they are. That becomes transformed, that they are Eish themselves. They are the Torah. That's the Shechina transformed into the Or. So the Rebbe is going to bring out that this is, in essence, the difference between the whole avodah of Torah and Tefillah. The above mentioned distinction between Torah and mitzvahs in their pula in the Amygdala prati. The difference between Torah and mitzvahs, how they impact the personal Amygdala. Das heißt, in them in was lernen Torah, the Jew who studies Torah, when he's mekayem mitzvahs, how they impact that person. And also how it impacts the general Migdash, between the Orin and the general the Mishkan. So that comes because of the difference between Torah and mitzvahs, how they're tied and they're united with godliness. If Torah state, with regards to Torah, it says, Torah and Hashem is one. It says Torah and Lakus is eins, it's one. Nit wie azach was is verbunden mit noch azach. It's not like one thing connected to another thing. No, she's chad, it's one. It says ein mitzvah. Torah and Hashem is one mitzvah. The kegen mitzvahs, as opposed to when we talk about mitzvahs, they are the will of the Supreme. They are referred to as limbs of the king. If we take an example from the limbs below, notwithstanding the fact that they are subjugated to the soul, but they're not united, they're not fused with the soul. Inyan mitzvahs, what is mitzvahs? Is an unzog to mention. It's a instruction to a person. But not as Torah, which exists even without learning Torah. Torah is there. And therefore, learn Torah. When a Yid learn Torah, which is his blessed wisdom, which is one with godliness, this impacts by the Yid that causes him to connect, to unite, to fuse with Torah and godliness. Or Yid is become a mitzvah, but when a Yid fulfills a mitzvah, and he does the will and the command from Hashem, but that's a command and an instruction to a Yid. Poil does a bittel of der Mensch. It causes the person to subjugate. He subjugates himself. He fulfills Hashem's will. But he does not become one with the mitzvah. He does not fuse with the mitzvah. Yud. So like them, that man klarer verstehen. According to this, we can more clearly understand in them that how in the idea when we make Hashem's resting amongst them, afila nor in them chelik derfun von zu machen dir lois borg batachtonim. Even if we want to just do that part, not that fusing part, that level, the higher level, just to make for Hashem a dwelling betachtonim, fazit sich seiderinyan von Torah und seiderinyan von mitzvah. We need both. We need Torah and mitzvahs to accomplish adir lois borg. The kavona was nisava kodesh baruch hu liis lois borg dir betachtonim. What is the intent that Hashem had a desire to make for him a blessed, a dwelling place in the lower worlds? It is that his blessed essence should rest here below in this low world, this our world, lower world. Which is there's nothing lower. This is the lowest. So here we need, in order to bring down and accomplish this intent, we need two things. Aleph, inyan was we need something to draw atzmus. And Beis Aninim was spoiled as the Amshochas of Zayim Tachtonim. And then another aspect is that you need to bring down into the lower. This is the Chelek zwischen Torah and mitzvahs. This is the difference between Torah and mitzvahs. Torah v'balda zaraisa v'kutsha b'richu kulu chad. Since the Torah kutsha b'richu is one, is al yodam shochas atzmos. Through the Torah we brought down atzmos because that is connected with atzmos because raisa v'kutsha b'richu kulu chad. The Torah and Hashem is one. As spoiled over need, but that does not impact as atzmos is baruch zodim shechar b'tachtonim that it should draw down into the lower. Since as apila v'Torah kum tarop lemata, even as the Torah descends below, is the hecher faris lapshus. It's still beyond being able to be dressed up. Like mitzvahs, as opposed to when we talk about limbs, the limbs of the king, the mitzvahs were the limbs of the king. When they come down below, they dress up in physical manners. Contrary, not only do they dress up, this is called inyana mitzvahs. This is the entire idea of the mitzvahs. To take physical matters that are low, and to impact them, to sort them out, refine them by doing the mitzvah with them. Is al yedei poiltmen. So through them we impact. As Amshochas Atzmusi is Borech, that this Atzmus should come down in Tachtonim. Torah is what draws Atzmus, and Mitzvahs brings it down to the Tachtonim. Yudalef. So he's verstandig that Hemshech und the Sheiches from the Beide members. Now we understand the flow and the connection of these two statements. Was ein oir shel gehenem sheletes betamut chochem. First, we bring down that the fire of the Gehenna does not dominate the Chacham. And then Posh Yisrael. And the connection to the Sugya, to this discussion, the Gemara. And those was the Meimeres bringers of Davke Mesechta Chagiga, and not Mesechta Erevin. And this, that these two statements are brought specifically in the tractate Chagiga, not Erevin. The Teuchen from Beide Meimeres, the idea of both, the content of both Seidim is, as that you must reflect on the details of the matters. And then you see, as by Eden, by a Yid, whether side by a Talmud Chacham, or side by Posh Yisrael, whether it's a Yid or Posh Yisrael, Zayin and the Aveda Shebahem, their sins nor atzipur. They're merely a cover. And it's secondary to them. And the Iker Shobahem is Tovik Dusha. The main of them is good and holy. And das kommt to the Behemshach to their Sugya Frier. This comes as a follow-up to the discussion, the Sugya before, Benegeya, the Mizbeach is in the Amygdala, as it relates to the Mizbeach in the base in the Amygdala. As they cannot mekabel zayin kin tuma, because they don't receive tuma liyois. Since as a hisboinus in the Protadvorim, when you reflect on the details of this matter, this shows that their cover of the metal is bottle legabi ikenam mizbeach. It's secondary to the main of the mizbeach, which is the entire sikha that we learned before. This was the same sikha, the whole idea of the shittas Rabbi Lozer, the shit. Beshamai and the Shita of the Chachamim, which is Beis Hillel, that they look not on the surface but look on the details, and therefore you see that the matches is bottled relative to the Mizbeach. The baldas in Ashros Ashchinish Mishkan Zayin and Dod debate in Yonim, and since in the Mishkan we have both aspects, Inyan HaTorah and Inyan HaMitzvahs, the Torah Mitzvahs, the River. The Gemara so the Gemara brings a follow-up by the Migdosh Haproti Shebekol Echad V'Echad MiYisrael. By the personal Migdosh, by each one, just like in the Beis Hamikdash, the Tzipim, by the Mizbeach, in the personal Beis Hamikdash, as the Migdosh says, I don't debate in Yonim for Torah Mitzvahs. The person also Torah Mitzvahs. But this is the Rikir from Yadar and Fuzay. That's the main. Beim Talmud Chochem and by Posh Yisrael, the main thing is their Torah and the main thing is the mitzvahs. Und das kann nicht bottled werden auf der Avedis. That cannot be negated, cannot be nullified through Avedis. Warum sehnen, wo seinen Nora Zipui, the Gabi Zeretz Mitzias, they are just a covering, they're a layer over who they are, their essence. Moving to say that. Now we also understand why the Gemara goes in this order. First, Rabbi Loz, the case of Talmid Chacham, and then the Pashi Yisrael. Früher bring the Gemara the Meimer Benegei Talmid Chacham. First, the Gemara brings a statement with regards to Talmid Chacham. Und erst danach wegen Pashi Yisrael, and then it brings about Pashi Yisrael. Agamas in the Gemara where the Mont Mizbech Hazov erst beim zweiten Meimer Benegei Pashi Yisrael. Although, as Rebbe asked earlier, the Mizbech Hazov in the cases by the second statement, the statement of Reish Lakish. But Lazoi is there say that Bechlal. This is the order generally. Limud, maybe l'demaisa. You have to first Torah and then do the action. When Lazoi oich in der Peula von Hashros Hashchina in Migdosh, Hakloli Baproti, the impact of the resting of the Shechina in the general Migdosh and the personal Migdosh, first we bring down the Atzmos Torah. Und danach wird es nimmt betachtonim al der mitzvahs, and then it comes down betachtonim through the mitzvahs. This is Mesichas Chof Menachamov, Tov Shel Lamed Aleph, and Divra Maschil Pod B'Sholem Tov Shin Lamed Beis.